Dread King, you wanted to know how the Countess was after you made your inappropriate advances to her. Well, I saw her today at the castle at Roxburgh. You were right to station guards there just in case the Scots pursued her again. There was no point in me trying to deny that you sent me to see her, because I knew she would make the connection right away. Let's face it, the woman is as wise as she is beautiful, honorable, and faithful. So curb your temper, because I didn't come here just to get my fair share of abuse from you. It was obvious that she was practiced in the art of deception, and that's how she outsmarted you. How do I know? Well, I could tell by her blood-stained hands that she wasn't bluffing when she threatened to stab herself if you were really willing to kill her husband, because he was in her heart. I don't know what you were thinking, but you can't possibly believe that her always honorable father, Warwick, would seriously talk her into being unfaithful to her husband just so that you could get what you want. You can't allow your selfish and lustful fantasies to always come before your honor and duty as a king, even if that means that you're not going to get what you want. Look at it this way. You needed to get the Scots back in line, and I prophesize that your very pregnant wife, Queen Philippa, will be able to do this. You needed to subdue the French, so you sent your son Ned, and despite the overwhelming odds against him, I believe that he'll be successful. Your Majesty, Edward, at some point you need to realize that you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometime, you just might find that you get what you need. Now, please, my lord, I finally got this out of my system. I'd appreciate it if you didn't bring it up again, because I'm telling you now, if you start me up, I'll never stop. In the mid-1970s, my very first job was as a delivery boy for Chicken Delight in Westbury, New York on Long Island. One of our favorite daily rituals was watching The Honeymooners' classic 39 episodes every night at 6:30 p.m. Naturally, we were thrilled in the mid-80s when CBS announced the discovery of more than 100 lost episodes of The Honeymooners. In 1996, Yale University Press was the first to authenticate Edward III as being at least partially written by William Shakespeare in around 1592 or 1593. Therefore, I am once again thrilled with the opportunity to present this new, old, lost, found, and authenticated Shakespeare play, so let's take a look at the plot. The French Count of Artois has defected and confirms that King Edward III of England is the true heir to the previous King of France. However, a French ambassador named Lorraine arrives and insists that Edward do homage to the new French king, John II, for his lands in Guyenne, also known as Aquitaine for you Love's Labour's Lost fans. Edward angrily defies him and insists that he will invade France to defend his claim. At the same time, another messenger arrives announcing that the Scots have besieged Roxburgh Castle in the north of England. Edward decides to deal with this problem first. The castle is being held by the beautiful Countess of Salisbury, who is the wife of the Earl of Salisbury. As Edward's armies arrive, the rampaging Scots flee before he even gets there. Edward is immediately taken with the Countess's beauty and wants to leave, but she entreats him to stay. Then the king proceeds to woo her for himself, and even though she rebuffs him, he still persists. In an attempted bluff, the Countess offers to take the life of her husband if Edward will take the life of his wife, Queen Philippa. However, when the Countess sees that Edward is agreeable to her suggestion, she threatens to take her own life instead if he continues his sexual advances. Finally, Edward expresses great shame, admits his fault, and relents. Then he secretly decides to use his energies and pursue his rights and duties as the king. In the second part of the play, Edward joins his armies in France as they fight to obtain the French throne. He and the French King John exchange arguments for their respective claims before the Battle of Crécy. King Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince, also known as Ned, is knighted and sent into battle. However, the king refuses to send any help to his son, even though it appears that the young man's life may be in danger. But Prince Edward proves himself in battle and defeats the King of Bohemia. After the English win the battle, the French flee to Poitiers. King Edward sends the prince to pursue them while he lays siege to Calais. In Poitiers, the prince finds himself outnumbered and seemingly surrounded. The play switches back and forth between the French and the English camps, where the obvious hopelessness of the English campaign is contrasted with the arrogance of the French. Prince Edward broods about the morality of war before achieving victory in the Battle of Poitiers against apparently insurmountable odds, and in the end he captures King John of France. Meanwhile, in Calais, the citizens recognize that they will have to surrender to King Edward. Initially, the king demands that 6 of the leading citizens be sent out to face punishment by being drawn and quartered. However, Edward's pregnant wife, Queen Philippa, arrives just in a nick of time after having led a military campaign in Scotland and successfully persuades her husband to pardon them. Sir John Copeland delivers David II, King of the Scots, who was captured in battle, to Edward, and a messenger informs the king that the English have secured Brittany as well. Unfortunately, that news is overshadowed by the news that Edward, Prince of Wales, is facing certain defeat at Poitiers. But just as King Edward declares that he will seek revenge, Prince Edward arrives with news of his conquest and brings with him the captured French King John II, and the English enter Calais in victorious triumph. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Edward III. Regardless of who wrote the entire play, many of the characters in Edward III are extremely well written and interesting. Let's start with Edward himself. He's the King of England who's married to Queen Philippa, who not only goes into battle without him, but does so while she's very pregnant. In real life, the couple had 8 sons and 5 daughters, although the play really only includes Ned, the oldest son, who was also known as Edward, Prince of Wales, or Edward the Black Prince. Edward III starts out being a noble character, very similar to Henry V, but once he sets his eyes on the Countess of Salisbury, he turns into a lech and forgets the fact that he's married, and she's married to one of his loyal nobles, the Earl of Salisbury. At that point, he resembles more Lord Angelo than Henry V from Measure for Measure, whose inappropriate and unsuccessful propositions to Isabel are also refuted. Ned, on the other hand, remains loyal, valiant, and honorable throughout the entire play. It's a shame he died so young in real life because he would have made an excellent king. King John is the King of France who talks big, but in reality is a very weak king and military leader. His 2 sons, Prince Charles, also known as the Dauphin, and Prince Philip, are also featured in this play. Ironically, both of them are more honorable than their father, the king. The Earl of Warwick is the Countess's father, who faces a terrible ethical dilemma when Edward III demands that he demonstrate his loyalty to the king by talking his married daughter into having an affair with Edward. The Earl of Salisbury is a noble and loyal subject of the king and husband to the Countess. We never hear him learn about Edward III trying to seduce his wife, but he does play an important role in France when he demonstrates his trust in Villiers, a French prisoner of his, whom he releases in order to get a passport for him from Prince Charles so that he could go to Calais. Villiers insists on going back to his captor when at first he's refused the passport, rather than demonstrate dishonor to his enemy, making him an extremely interesting and noble character. When we return, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes from Edward III. In this early play, Shakespeare leans heavily on one of his favorite plot devices, prophecies. There are 3 prophecies concerning the French army's chances that an old hermit tells the Dauphin. First, that feathered fowl will make the French army tremble, but we don't know why. The second prophecy says that flintstones will rise and break the battle array. And the third prophecy says that the French will go as far into England as England has ventured into France. Now, this last one is an amphiboly. An amphiboly is defined as a cryptic statement that could mean 2 completely opposite things. I found some examples of humorous amphiboles taken from news headlines. Burglar gets 9 months in violin case. Juvenile court to try shooting defendant. Red tape holds up new bridge. And 2 convicts evade noose, jury hung. If you know anything about Shakespearean prophecies, they are deliberately vague and are often misinterpreted by the hearers. Shakespeare also uses battles between overwhelming forces and underdog victors with few casualties as a plot device. This is very similar to what we saw in the Battle of Agincourt in Henry V. As far as memorable scenes go, let's just take a look at 2. Keep in mind that this play was originally written in scenes without any acts listed. In scene 2, we see Edward III meet the Countess of Salisbury for the very first time. He's completely enamored of her and quickly employs his secretary Lodowick to write some love poetry so that he can woo the Countess. Of course, the king doesn't tell him who it's for. Later on in the same scene, we see the Countess outsmart King Edward after she realizes that he's even willing to kill his own pregnant wife and her husband in order to have an affair with her. It's only after the Countess is willing to take her own life that Edward realizes that he can never have her and attempts to break free of his all-consuming infatuation. And finally, in scene 18, Queen Philippa, who is leading a battle despite being very pregnant, rendezvous with her husband and delivers the captured Scottish King David II. She also persuades her husband to show mercy and spare the lives of 6 French supplicants whom he was originally planning to kill. We also see Edward, the Prince of Wales, defy overwhelming odds of French troops to emerge victoriously and deliver King John II of France to his father. What a great way to end a history play. When we return, we'll look at some of the major themes that run through Edward III. As with many of Shakespeare's other history plays, the topics of honor and loyalty are also prevalent in Edward III. The most honorable characters in the play are Ned, the Prince of Wales, the Countess of Salisbury, and Villiers, a French prisoner of the Earl of Salisbury. Ned is not only a loyal son to his father, but he's an incredibly brave and successful warrior who also overcomes incredible odds to defeat the French. The Countess of Salisbury isn't just virtuous, faithful, and loyal, but to her husband and to her king. She's also very clever and finds a solution when she's left to her own devices to fend off the advances of her sovereign. In addition, we see that Villiers is a man of integrity. He's freed by the Earl of Salisbury in order to get him a passport to Calais. However, when Prince Charles refuses to give him one, Villiers insists on keeping his word to Salisbury and returning to him even though he's already free. Shakespeare doesn't usually depict very many honorable Frenchmen, but certainly Villiers is one of the most noble. And then you have the Earl of Warwick, who takes an oath to serve the king and then is forced into an impossible situation in which he must act on the king's behalf to convince his own daughter to be unfaithful to her husband and sleep with the king. Fortunately, he doesn't allow his oath to stop him from encouraging her when she refuses his instructions. I also want to give special mention to Queen Philippa, who is also loyal to her husband even though he doesn't deserve her. She not only goes into battle without her husband while she's pregnant, she also captures the King of Scotland and pleads for mercy for the poor supplicants in France. What a remarkable woman. Once again, when it comes to courage, Edward III's son Ned continuously proves himself on and off the battlefield as a man of integrity, mercy, and remarkable military strength. He's fearless despite overwhelming odds and never wavers from his mission. In fact, at the end of the play, he asks King Edward if he will send him to places like Spain and Turkey should England need protecting. The Countess of Salisbury is another remarkable character who demonstrates her courage against King David II and Sir William Douglas of Scotland, even when she's a captive of theirs. She also stands up to her father, the Earl of Warwick, when he tries to persuade her to sleep with the king despite the fact that she's married. And of course, let's not forget that she refuses Edward III's advances and also demonstrates that she would be willing to die before dishonoring her husband. There are also several characters who excel in compassion in Edward III. Of course, there's Queen Philippa, who intervenes on behalf of 6 French supplicants whom she doesn't even know, and successfully persuades her husband to show mercy and spare their lives, not unlike what Hippolyta and Emily do for Arcite and Palamon when pleading in The Two Noble Kinsmen. Once again, we have Ned, the Prince of Wales, who, like Hector in Troilus and Cressida, believes in giving his opponents a fair chance by showing them mercy in victory. I wouldn't really call King John of France compassionate, because he only shows mercy when he's guilted into sparing the Earl of Salisbury because his son, Prince Charles, almost shames him into honoring his promise and his word. When we return, we'll look at some of the most powerful lines in Edward III. In Act 1, Scene 3, we have the perfect opportunity to appreciate why having this play authenticated as a work of William Shakespeare's is so valuable to us. His description of the Countess of Salisbury makes her one of his greatest heroines. Were it not bad enough that her sovereign asks her to break her marriage vows, he even gets the Countess's own father Warwick to go to bat for him as well. Here we see the Countess reacting to her father's obligated attempt to have his daughter cheat on her husband with King Edward. Unnatural besiege! Woe me, unhappy! To have escaped the danger of my foes and to be 10 times worse environed by friends? Hath he no means to stain my honest blood, but to corrupt the author of my blood to be his scandalous and vile solicitor? No marvel, though, the branches be then infected, when poison hath encompassed the root. No marvel, though, the leprous infant die, when the stern dame envenometh the dug. Why then give sin a passport to offend, and youth the dangerous reign of liberty? Blot out the strict forbidding of the law, and cancel every canon that prescribes a shame for shame, or penance for offense. No, let me die, if his too boisterous will have it so, before I will consent to be an actor in his graceless lust. Of course, it's one thing to tell your father that you're not going to sleep with the king. It's another thing to tell the king himself. In Scene 3, the Countess is willing to stab herself to death to get Edward to stop pursuing her. She seems perfectly willing to go through with her threat, but finally realizing that she's never going to yield her body to him, King Edward reluctantly and shamefully gives up his lusty advances, saying, "Even by that power I swear that gives me now the power to be ashamed of myself, I never mean to part my lips again in any words that tends to such a suit. Arise, true English lady, whom our isle may better boast of than ever Roman might of her, whose ransacked treasury hath tasked the vain endeavor of so many pens. Arise, and be my fault thy honor's fame, which after ages shall enrich thee with. I am awaked from this idle dream." It's not until this point that Edward finally regains his focus and stops his sexual advances of the Countess. Scene 12 is one of the few parts of the play that most authenticators agree Shakespeare wrote. A good argument for that is the incredible dialogue between Audley and Ned, the Prince of Wales. The two of them anticipate they're going to be killed in battle soon, yet they encourage each other by demonstrating their bravery in the face of death. Audley begins, "To die is all as common as to live. The one in choice, the other holds in chase. For from the instant we begin to live, we do pursue and hunt the time to die. First bud we, then we blow, and after seed, then presently we fall, and as a shade follows the body, so we follow death. If then we hunt for death, why do we fear it? If we fear it, why do we follow it? If we do fear, how can we shun it? If we do fear with fear, we do but aid the thing we fear to seize on us the sooner. If we fear not, then no resolved proffer can overthrow the limit of our fate, for whether ripe or rotten, drop we shall, as we do draw the lottery of our doom." Having heard his colleague's fearless words, Ned adds his agreement to Audley's, saying, "Ah, good old man, 1,000 armors these words of thine have buckled on my back. Ah, what an idiot hast thou made of life to seek the thing it fears, and how disgraced the imperial victory of murdering death, since all the lives his conquering arrows strike seek him, and he not them, to shame his glory. I will not give a penny for a life, nor half a penny to shun grim death, since for to live is but to seek to die, and dying but beginning of new life. Let come the hour when he that rules it will, to live or die I hold indifferent." When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in Edward III and correlations to some of the other Shakespeare plays. All right, now let's take a look at 3 key turning points in Edward III. Remember, this play did not originally have acts in it, only scenes. First, we have Scene 2, where David II and Douglas of Scotland flee as soon as they hear that Edward III is approaching. This eliminates the threat of the Scots and allows the English to focus most of their energies into invading France. Also in Scene 2, and continuing into Scene 3, we have Edward propositioning the Countess of Salisbury, who stands her ground and is willing to give up her life rather than be unfaithful to her husband. It's her genuine demonstrations of courage and defiance that finally get Edward III to come to his senses, stop pursuing her, and focus on his legitimate responsibilities as a king and a husband. There are also many correlations to other Shakespeare plays, but perhaps none more than to Henry V. For example, we have the French heralds who continuously offer the King of England a chance to surrender, both Edward the Black Prince and Henry V overcome enormous odds and defeat the French by overwhelming numbers and only lose a small percentage of their own armies to do it. Both Edward III and Henry V are barred from their rightful succession as King of France when the French invoke the Salic laws. Edward III is married but pursues the married countess, although he's forced to abandon his attempts. Henry VIII is married but pursues the single Anne Boleyn and marries her. Edward IV, who is single but betrothed to Lady Bona, pursues the widowed Lady Grey and marries her in Henry VI Part 3. Lord Angelo is single but pursues Isabel, a nun, to satisfy his lust in Measure for Measure. Governor Lysimachus pursues Marina for lust in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, but eventually marries her instead. And Suffolk is married, but pursues Margaret, who's single, but betrothed to Henry VI in Henry VI Part 1. King John of France breaks his oath to the Earl of Salisbury, like Prince John did in The Forest of Gautreks in Henry IV, Part 2, and Richard, Duke of York, does in Henry VI, Part 3. The Countess defends her honor like Hermione in The Winter's Tale, Isabel in Measure for Measure, Lady Grey in Henry VI, Part 3, Marina in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, Sylvia in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, and Catherine of Aragon in Henry VIII. Calais closed its gates to King Edward. Angiers wouldn't let Kings John or Philip in The Life and Death of King John. York hesitated to let the Duke of York in Henry VI, Part 3, and the town of Harfleur closed its gates to Henry in Henry V. Ned is surrounded by French troops, but emerges victorious, unlike Lord John Talbot in Henry VI, Part 1. Queen Philippa gets Edward III to show compassion to his enemies at Calais. Henry Bolingbroke showed compassion for O'Merle, his cousin, and the Bishop of Carlisle in Richard II. The newly crowned Henry V shows compassion to the Lord Chief Justice in Henry IV, Part 2. Henry VI shows compassion towards Jack Cade's followers in Henry VI, Part 2. And finally, Richmond shows compassion toward the enemy troops at the end of Richard III. Edward III bears some resemblance to Tarquin, who rapes the wife of his friend in Shakespeare's poem, The Rape of Lucrece. We also have a couple of biblical correlations. First, there's Edward, Prince of Wales, who, when his father asks him what a picture is, explains, "A pelican, my lord, wounding her bosom with her crooked beak, that so her nest of young ones might be fed with drops of blood that issue from her heart. The motto, sic et vos, and so should you." Having grown up in the Roman Catholic faith all my life, I recognize this symbol, which is used to demonstrate how Christ shed his own blood to feed his children. We're supposed to make similar sacrifices for those we serve. And finally, anyone familiar with the biblical story of David and Bathsheba will recognize that just as David was consumed with lust after seeing the naked Bathsheba bathing, and being king had her submit to his will, even though she was married to Uriah, who David arranged to have killed in battle, Edward III is also driven by lust to sleep with the beautiful married Countess of Salisbury, and is not only willing to have her husband killed to do so, but his own pregnant wife, Queen Philippa, as well. Fortunately, the Countess outsmarts him and successfully resists his advances, at least in the play, if not in real life. When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about Edward III. In preparing to do this episode, I did some research on Edward III, and this is what I found. Edward III was believed to be written between 1592 and 1593, and was first performed in 1596. However, it has only been accepted into the canon of plays written by William Shakespeare since 1996, when Yale University Press first authenticated it as a Shakespeare play. It took another 21 years for Cambridge, Oxford, Arden, and Riverside to follow suit. In 1596, it was published anonymously, which was common practice in the 1590s. It's highly believed that Shakespeare was responsible for writing scenes 2, 3, 12, and possibly 13, as well as several other pieces throughout the play. It's also speculated that the other likely contributors might have included some combination of Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, George Peele, and Thomas Nash. However, no one is 100% certain of their contributions or involvement. There are two thoughts as to why Edward III was left out of the First Folio, which contained many of Shakespeare's other plays. The first is that it was published anonymously, which might have been to prevent sharing the profits with the publisher. The second reason is that it may have been banned in 1598 or 1599 because the Scottish ambassador complained to the Queen of England about the cowardly depictions of the Scottish army. Since Shakespeare's first quattro was not published until 1623, Edward III had already been out of circulation for nearly a quarter of a century and was probably long forgotten by that time. One of the reasons why the play is believed to have been written by William Shakespeare is that it contains the line, "Lilies that fester spell far worse than weeds," which is also the last line of Shakespeare's sonnet number 94. And Shakespeare used the phrase "scarlet ornaments" both in Edward III and in line 6 of sonnet number 142. The play's subject matter also bears some resemblance to Shakespeare's poem, The Rape of Lucrece. Edward the Black Prince is also referenced in Henry V, and Edward III was the grandfather to Richard II, who succeeded Edward as the king because Richard's father, the Black Prince, died before him. Most people agree that Shakespeare was responsible for creating the role of the Countess of Salisbury in this play. However, although she successfully fights off Edward III's romantic advances, in real life she is remembered as the English noblewoman whom King Edward of England raped in 1341, according to the true chronicles of John le Bel. As with Henry VI Part 1, Edward III drastically compresses its action and historical events, placing the Battle of Poitiers immediately after the Battle of Crécy and before the capture of Calais. However, in real life, the Battle of Poitiers took place 10 years after the earlier victory and capture of Calais. The compression also necessitated that several characters be merged together. For example, the French king throughout the play is John II of France, even though the Battle of Crécy had actually been fought against his predecessor, Philip VI of France. When we return, we'll look at some of the remarkable actors in the 2009 St. Louis Shakespeare Festival performance of Edward III. Edward III was first authenticated as a Shakespeare play in 1996. However, the BBC Shakespeare collection was completed in 1985, about 10 or 11 years earlier. That play and The Two Noble Kinsmen were not included in their complete dramatic works of William Shakespeare DVD set. When I first went online to find a DVD of this play, I discovered that none exist. Indeed, I thought I would be making this episode without ever having seen the play performed. But fortunately, just a couple of days before I was about to make this episode, I found a wonderful free production on YouTube by the Shakespeare Festival of St. Louis, which was performed in March of 2009. I encourage you to take a look at it by going to www.stl.shakespeare.org. In appreciation for their efforts, I'd like to identify the actors here. Edward III was played by Cameron Ulrich. Prince Edward was played by Aaron Orion Baker. Lord Audley was played by Andrew Keller. The Earl of Warwick was played by Charles Huvelman. Lodowick was played by Al Erickson. The Earl of Derby was played by Richard Byquist. Lord Montague was played by James Canfield. The Count of Artois and the French Mariner were both played by Roger Erb. The Earl of Salisbury was played by Todd Piper. The Esquire and the Herald were both played by Joshua Nash Payne. Queen Philippa and the Frenchwoman were both played by Suki Peters. The Countess of Salisbury was played by Andrea Lutzeller. King John of France was played by Ben Ritchie. Prince Charles of France was played by Nicholas Henderson. Villiers and Sir William Douglas were both played by Kurt Jarvis. The Duke of Lorraine was played by Ethan Jones. The French herald and captain were both played by James Lewis. Another French herald and messenger were played by Samuel Cotton. And a third herald was played by Jimmy Crossick. King David II was played by Chris Jones, and the entire production was directed by Donna Northcott. Well done, all of you, and thank you for your efforts. And if that weren't enough, I also found a free Zoom version on YouTube in which an organization called Shakespeare 2020 LA did a magnificent job of reading the entire play online, which I highly encourage you to watch. I like this version even better because each of the 12 actors put their characters' names below their screen images so that you could tell who they were playing, even if they had to change characters throughout the play. Many of them also dressed and changed outfits for their roles, and the audio and video quality is superb. So now let me thank these talented 12 for generously sharing their gifts with the world that they created during a pandemic. Mary Carrick played Queen Philippa. Christopher Carbo played King Edward III. Taylor Marr played Edward the Black Prince. Sacha Byrne played the Countess of Salisbury and the prisoner Villiers. Megan Wells played Prince Philip of France. Chris Klein played the Earl of Salisbury, the Duke of Lorraine, and Sir James Audley. Caitlin McCormick played a messenger and various other roles. Elizabeth Jovenot also played a messenger and various other roles. Elise Ashton played the Count of Artois and various other roles. Julie Grossman played King John of France, and Jason Rene not only narrated but directed the entire play. Congratulations to this entire company of selfless and talented professionals. And I also want to thank Tim Nance, who did a magnificent summary of Edward III on YouTube, which contained an enormous wealth of knowledge about the play and its history. Now stay tuned for today's trivia challenge, which is called Jacks Are Wild. All right, now it's time for today's trivia challenge, which is called Jacks Are Wild. The name Jack is mentioned several times in different Shakespeare plays. Name the play from which each of these lines is taken. Number 1. Our wooing does not end like an old play. Jack hath not Jill. Number 2. She did call me rascal fiddler and twangling Jack. And number 3. Jack shall have Jill, naught shall go ill. When we return, I'll have the answers for you, as well as some relevant lessons from Edward III. Okay, now let's see how you did on today's trivia challenge called Jacks Are Wild. The name Jack is mentioned several times in different Shakespeare plays. You were to name the play from which each of these lines is taken. Number 1. Our wooing doth not end like an old play. Jack hath not Jill. That was Barone from Love's Labour's Lost. Number 2. She did call me rascal fiddler and twangling Jack. That was Hortensio in The Taming of the Shrew. And number 3. Jack shall have Jill, naught shall go ill. That was the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now let's wrap up with some relevant lessons from Edward III. First, live with integrity. Ned, Villiers, and the Countess all had it. Regardless of rank, remember there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. Second, there's no such thing as business ethics. You can't be ethical at work and unethical in your personal life. You either have ethics or you don't. Make sure you're consistent and congruent in your words and your actions. And finally, in every adversity, there lies the seed of an equivalent advantage. Ned and Audley faced terrible odds against the French, but they faced their opponents with bravery and courage. When they ran out of arrows, they pivoted, picked up flintstones, and in the end, they emerged victoriously. Just remember, you can never fail if you never give up. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo on Shakespeare. Please join me next time when a Roman emperor faces an assassination attack and winds up with many daggers in his back.